Hello, everybody. I hope that everybody is having a wonderful Friday so far, or depending on where you are in the world. The end of your workday is near. If you're working, it's fabulous to be back on my monthly Findmypast Friday. We already have some people chiming in. So hello, Robin, from Toronto. It's a chilly and gray day up in Toronto. It is so fabulous to be back with you guys. I only get to do this about once a month now, and I kind of miss it. Sally is with us near Oxford, also chilly and gray there. Lots of you chiming in now. Helena is in Lancashire. Patricia, I don't know how to pronounce that. Ashby de la Zouch. I'm not sure, Patricia. That one I'm going to have to Google. Diane is chiming in from Edinburgh. Denise is in Cheshire. Oh, Claire from Adelaide, thank you so much for joining us all the way in Australia. George is in Essex. It's damp but not too cold. So, as many of you know, my name is Jen Baldwin. I am the content acquisition manager for North America for Findmypast, and I do a whole bunch of other stuff too. And it's very exciting. It's always a good time to be here on Findmypast Friday. Sherry, good morning from Oregon. Paula's in Boston. Jackie's in Sussex. Paul is in Walton-on-Thames. Ellen's in Illinois. It's good to have you guys back. I'm seeing some very familiar names. It's always good to connect with people kind of over and over. Oh, Mary from Oklahoma. I don't know that I've met you yet, Mary. So hello and welcome. I think I would have remembered somebody in Oklahoma. It's very close. I am in Colorado, and northern Colorado to be precise. And it is beautiful and sunny, although it's quite cold overnight in the mornings. And though during the day we've been getting up to very warm temperatures, so in the low 70s Fahrenheit, and that's very unusual. We're not getting enough precipitation out in the west. We need some more snow in those mountains. Janine's with us from Utah. Sean is from New Zealand. Oh, Roxanne's also in Utah. It's really good. It's so, I love, this is part of what I love about these hours that I get to spend with you guys. It's just such a broad range of individuals from so many different places across the world. Like, I just think that's really exciting. What a cool thing we're doing here, right? Jessie has introduced herself in the comments, but please say hello to Jessie, my colleague out in London. Jessie is relatively new to the Findmypast family, and I think this is the first time we've had a chance to do a live together. So please say hello to Jessie and make sure that you're commenting. We've got Elaine in from Massachusetts. Rosemary's in Northern Ireland. Ruth is in Central New Jersey. So good. Anya is with us as well. Let's see what she say. Taking a pause from the genealogy show to catch us live today. Thank you so much. That's lovely. I know they have a great program this year. Jessie, Ellen says, welcome to the mayhem, Jessie. I think that's pretty funny. She's doing fabulous. And actually some of the research she's already done on this week's records actually taught me quite a bit. So Jessie's been a great addition to the team. Audrey is at those offices in Kew, nearly dark, and still have a lot of work to do. I think that is the story of all of us right now. Obviously, the 1921 census of England and Wales is just right on the immediate horizon. For Findmypast and for the National Archives. And gosh, we just couldn't be even more excited. It's a lot of work, but it's been absolutely thrilling to be a part of it. It's really a pleasure to be a part of something so substantial as a census release like this. It's really amazing. So, right. So what have I been working on? A few months ago, I promised y'all that I would start my sessions with a quick recap of what I've been doing from a genealogical perspective, because I don't just work for a genealogy company, right? I am a genealogist as well. I have been for a long time. And of course, most of my time in the last few weeks has really been focused on the 1921 census. So I have been educating myself. That's really where most of my time has been. I have been learning a lot about the period, mostly thanks to articles I've been finding on JSTOR. I love that resource. If you haven't used JSTOR at all, by all means, get yourself in there. You can get a free account, or you can access it through a local university or library system. to get all of that information. But those materials are really, really helpful and useful. I have a whole binder, and yes, I do print them. I know it's horrible, but I have really bad eyes, and it's hard for me to read off of an electronic device. So I do need to print them, but I've been just learning a lot. I actually read an article just last week. Again, had to read it a couple of times to keep myself fresh. And it was an article about the differences between the US Census and how they took their census and the UK. And it was written by an American. And so his tone, of course, was very, pro-American. But in the US, they went door to door with an enumerator, and you just have a big long list of people on a census page. It's not an individual return for every household. And he discussed how the UK had actually considered taking that approach. And then obviously we know that they did not. But it was just kind of interesting insight to compare his perspective. And he published the article in 1921. So it was interesting to get his perspective on the 1920 census in the United States and then the 1921 UK census. And so that kind of led me to further kind of going down that road. I do think it's going to be really interesting how many people and what kind of discoveries we're going to make, and the correlation between the 1921 UK and or England and Wales and the 1920 US census. I think some of that data and some of those academic findings, once the census is released, is going to be really phenomenal. We're going to see some great things out of academia over the next few months and years. So I took a look, right, just for my own kind of start at the comparison. And in the 1920 and the 1930 US Census, which of course is data we already have and have had access to that material for a long time. So in 1920, there were just over 820,000 people in the United States who listed themselves as born in England. And in 1930, that number went down to about 814,000. So about, 6,000 people-ish. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how that correlates and flips in the 1921 census, right? How many Americans were in England on census night and were enumerated as a result, right? And we know that, the war is over. And so there's a loud noise in the background. I don't know what just happened. Probably my cat. So I jumped a little. Ooh. The war is over, right? So there's an increase in tourism. But a lot of the U.S. ocean liners, the passenger liners, were converted into military vessels during the war. So was transportation as easy? I'm not so sure yet. Were tickets maybe more expensive? I don't know, right? That's something interesting that I kind of want to delve into a little bit. We also have prohibition, right, that starts in the U.S. And so are people, both British born and US citizens, are they leaving the country and vacationing more or spending more time internationally than they otherwise would have during the 20s because of prohibition, right? I think there's a lot of different kind of social history connections we can make, and I'm excited to get into that a little bit more. Once the census is released on January 6th, we'll be able to start kind of analyzing some of that data, and I think it's going to be really fascinating. So I hope you guys are all excited about it too. All right, so let's see. I'm scrolling through the comments just a little bit. Okay, well, obviously we're going to talk about the new records of the week, and then our topic today, our question of the week that I want you guys to be thinking about, and let me be all tricky and put it on the screen. What kind of education did your grandparents receive? And this topic kind of hit me a couple of weeks ago. I was at my dad's house, and he has a little book, and I actually think I might have gifted it to him a number of years ago. It's this little antique book, probably published in the 1910s or 1920s. I don't remember offhand. And it is, a school book, right? And it covers English and math and, some basic arithmetic. It's from an elementary level school curriculum. And it's very similar to what he would have used as a student, and he still has it. It's on his bookshelf, and I stumbled across it while I was visiting, and it kind of got me started thinking, like, I know quite a bit talking to my dad about his educational experience as a youth, but I don't really know all that much about my grandparents. And of course, all of this research into the period of the 1920s and 30s has kind of made me start to think about those kinds of questions and those kinds of elements. So That's this week's discussion. What kind of education did your grandparents receive? So please leave that in the comments, and we'll cover all of the records for the week. We'll talk about what we've released today, and then we'll get back to that. So as you comment in your response, please start your response with QOTW, so I know that it is for the question of the week, although that should be pretty easy to tell. But let's first cover this week's new records. Of course, we always want to talk about this week's new records. Oh, and I do want to, you know what? Actually, before we get into this, I'm going to pull up Sally's comment first. Listen to the talk with Ellie and Sally Hubert recently. My copy of Sally's book arrived today. I'm excited to go to bed and start reading. If you missed the conversations that we had on Facebook Live this week, go back and watch those recordings, because some of the topics that we discussed this week with Ellie and with Rose, absolutely fascinating conversations around fashion and style and trends during that same period, obviously the 1920s. So go back and watch those recordings if you haven't seen them. Okay, so this week's records, we've added two pretty significant collections from Kent. So if you have research in Kent, you should be pretty happy this weekend. We added 16,000 new burials specifically from the Watling Street Cemetery from 1855 to 1934. And there's some really interesting information about that cemetery in particular on this week's email. And the blog. So do check out those resources. There's some nuances around who was kind of in control of the cemetery and who wasn't. So some really interesting stuff to read up about. So 16,000 new burial records. And then the big one this week was the Kent electoral registers, 4.6 million new records for Kent. And they actually start as early as 1570. Most of them, the countywide coverage really begins in the 1830s. And those earliest records are from the boroughs of Faversham and Dover. But I mean, 1570 is super early, right? So that's pretty cool. And they are both parliamentary and local voter lists. So it's an index only. But once again, absolutely a resource for all of you to use as more of a finding aid, right? The original images are held at the Kent History and Library Center in Maidstone. So use the index on Findmypast as your finding aid to assist you in that research process, and then access or contact the Kent History and Library Center to get to the original image and that original source, because there's more information there, obviously, on the image than there will be in the index. So please make sure that you take advantage of the originals whenever you can. Always, always, always. In our research, we need to be looking at the originals whenever possible. So remember that those indexes are there as a finding aid and as a tool to really get into some of those records and to help you with that process. So it is always a good idea to attach those index records to your tree so that you don't lose sight of it. You have your full citation. You've got everything all kind of set and ready to go before you actually get over to the original image, depending on when and where you can access that image, right? Okay, let's see. Oh, yep, this is great. So these should help you, Victoria. Some London ancestors retired to Kent. So we've got burial records and voter lists for you. So that's exciting. You might get a little bit of both in these new collections, Victoria. I hope you have success there. That's pretty exciting. All right, cool. So lots of comments on the question of the week. Oh, and one cat comment. Have to get this one right. And Anya says, my cat decided to sneak in our Irish history class on Monday. They are cheeky, aren't they? It reminds me, last year, if you recall, we recorded that kind of Christmas message from the staff at Findmypast. And while I was recording, my cat was messing around in the Christmas tree right behind me. I always kind of giggle about that because, you know, your cat, like doing the Christmas tree thing, of course. All right, let's talk about our grandparents' education. There's been already some really interesting comments, and I'm going to focus my comments today on the UK the UK education system, because I wanted to learn more about that. I don't actually have any British ancestors in this time frame actually still living in the area. Or in the country, actually. They're all in the US by this point. But I I just wanted to get a different perspective and a different take on things. And I think it's useful to kind of analyze what other countries were doing, right? Especially similar countries, English speaking countries, right? The US was watching what the UK was doing, and the UK was watching what, Australia was doing. And there's all this, there's a lot of back and forth and crisscross, right? They came up with a good idea. Let's copy that. And so it's always helpful to get that kind of global perspective, I think. Okay. So, cats are family. They are important. Let's look at a couple of these comments just to see what y'all are talking about. And I think it starts with Andrew. Grandparents had been half timers from age 10, working from 6 a.m. to 12:30 in the mill, then school for 3 hours. Note, it was never the other way around. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give you guys some background on how some of these policies changed in just a few minutes. Claire says that both of her grandmothers were housewives and one was a single parent. Both my grandparents got degrees, one in mechanical engineering and the other arts and social studies, I believe. So yeah, that's pretty cool. I don't think any of my grandparents went to university, actually, or any kind of extended education. In fact, now that I'm thinking about that, I know that that's pretty much true. Yeah, I think it was my parents' generation were the first to go on to college and university and any kind of higher curriculum. So that's always an interesting perspective, right? To put it in kind of that timeline. Anya says, my gran was sent to a girls' school. It was the same school as Muriel Spark, who wrote The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. The book was based on Muriel's time at James Gillespie School. I'm not sure about my other 3 grandparents, but that's a cool connection. That's pretty neat. And, when you find that famous connection or somebody who had publicity, it's almost in many ways it's a lot easier to dig into that research, right? Because there's going to be more written about that author than about your ancestor, right? But that gives you that social context that you can latch onto, right? You know that there's going to be substantial more about Muriel Spark, so you study their life and then apply those learnings to your own peoples. I said peoples. That's funny. All right. Sarah says, a lot of my maternal grandfather's family had a university education, while most of my other grandparents finished their education between the ages of 12 and 14. So that's a great introduction, Sarah. Let's take a quick, brief second to review our history on the question of the week. So I did a little digging because I don't know that much about the UK education system. But I learned in the last week that there were several major acts that changed the way that our grandparents would have gone to school. The first that really took effect was the Fisher Act of 1918, and that actually raised the earliest age that they could end school to 14 years, right? So that became kind of the minimum. You had to attend from 5 years through 14. That became compulsory. That act also made some kind of secondary education system compulsory, right? So because they had to go through 14, they at some point had to leave the elementary system and move into that secondary education. The Fisher Act also allowed many of these schools to become state funded in central schools versus or the secondary schools. So it allowed for more funding, especially into the rural communities. And included provisions for part-time education for 14 to 18-year-olds. Now, there weren't a lot of people, I don't think, who took that up, but it included those elements. Then this 1918 Fisher Act, actually was not immediately implemented. Most of it had to wait until another act was passed in 1921 before it came into effect. So there were plans in the Fisher Act that expanded the third level education system, but a lot of that was dropped due to, budget cuts and such after the war. And again, the implementation of most of the act actually didn't occur until after 1921. So even though our grandparents may have attended school kind of, in the late 20s or 30s, you have to go a little bit further back than that to understand the system that was in place and the history behind that system and how it all kind of came to be. And then in 1929, we have a local government act that comes into play, and it changes. Poor law schools, they become now state-funded elementary schools. And the concept of junior technical schools was introduced in the 1930s, but it looks like very few were actually ever opened. So there was a lot of change happening in the 20s and 30s across the UK in terms of the education system. People were starting to think differently and offer different opportunities and kind of recognize the need for children at a higher age to continue to be enrolled. And of course, there's a lot happening in the 20s and 30s, right? There's this huge population increase after World War I. As the soldiers come home, more babies are born, right? That's just kind of how it works. And so in the mid 1920s, you start to see this huge increase in enrollment in local schools, right? Because now these babies are turning into 5 and 6 year olds and they got to go to school. And then, of course, we have the Great Depression that enters that period, and that affects families all over the globe severely, right? So there's a lot of impact there, and that impacts their ability to attend school as well. So some interesting background, and always good to know your law, right? Always good to know the details of what your ancestors were living with in terms of how the local government structured the system, right? Especially in something like a state-funded educational system. So there was a comment in here. Let's see. Someone said, oh yeah, here it is. Susan says, I have no idea about her grandparents' education and no clue how to research it. My grandparents died in Canada before I was born, and parents passed away when I was in my early 20s. So unfortunately, none of oral history has been passed down to Susan, it doesn't sound like. So if you have suggestions for Susan, please leave them in the comments. Respond to her question on the thread so that she can get some help from the community today. But Susan, I would start by actually Googling this, right? What was grandparents died in Canada? So if they grew up in Canada, what was the Canadian education system like? That's generally public knowledge, right? Most of the information that I found about the UK system is freely available on a number of different websites, including Wikipedia, right? So you can start there. I would also look at, if you know, and again, I'm making the assumption that they were raised in Canada, although you didn't indicate that. If you know what province they were in, reach out to the local society and the genealogical society and see if they have contextual information or resources they can point you to. Not necessarily school records, although those do exist, of course, but just that kind of general background information about, what's a good history book for this area of the world? What's the historical society? Is there a school museum of some kind, right? I know across the US there are schoolhouses, especially in the homestead states, that have been converted now into museums so people can see what it was like in that one-room schoolhouse. That's pretty prevalent. So your local genealogical society, historical organization around the area in which they lived should have some good starting resources for you. Let's see what others are saying. Leslie says, all of my grandparents went to school through 8th grade. My maternal grandfather attended college and university, so he was also working to support himself. As he was also working to support himself, he had to drop out. Oh, that's too bad. Hopefully he was able to finish at some point. Let's see. Elaine, my grandfather went up through 8th grade and wanted to continue, but his mother thought that would be shiftless. Oh no, that is quite a word to use. So he joined the U.S. Navy in 1913, served 3.5 years, got his master's plumber's license and re-enlisted in 1918, later got his GED. Loved education, encouraged starters to go into college. Yeah, so actually, yeah, that's interesting. And of course, now we're talking about the American system, right? So some of you may not be familiar with the GED. It's essentially a diploma that you can get or that is equivalent to a high school education. And you have to take a test and all of that to pass. But it's, his education career was quite different, right? We think about education in kind of like a public school system, but Elaine brings up a lot of different opportunities for education, right? The U.S. Navy provided an education in some capacities, right? They certainly would train you to do a particular job, and that would kind of set the foundation, at least for that naval career. And then he got his master's plumber's license and then re-enlisted in 1918. So there's, that's a whole nother military history story. And then later went back to school and got his GED. So he actually, definitely a life of education for sure. And encouraged his daughters to go into college, which is, making the next generation a little bit better, right? Okay, this one sounds interesting. My grandma was the youngest of 8 when she was born in 1901. She was the only one of the siblings to be sent to a private girls' school in Oxford. Interesting. Her brothers and sisters were very upset about this. And I think it caused a lot of arguments. I wonder why that decision was made, right? Was the family in a better financial situation by the time she was born? What was it that she got to go and no one else did? That's really interesting. And it does bring us, right back to how we research, right? And one of the things that I was thinking about as I was kind of writing up my notes for this was that we see things like scholar as an occupation on a census record. But you really have to think about what does that really mean, right? How many of us have just said, oh, scholar, okay, they were in school, they were a youth, they were young, and just kind of kept going, right? And kind of passed that by. But have we stopped to learn what scholar actually meant, right? And that was kind of part of the premise for today's talk was how did education work then? What did they actually learn, right? What were the lessons that were taught? What was the curriculum? And who taught them? And what kind of school was it? How was it funded? All of those questions started popping into my brain. I did learn that generally speaking, during the 1920s and 30s, school went from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., basically. They focused on reading, writing, and arithmetic. Kind of that classic 3 R's. But schools also had topics in nature study, singing, dancing lessons, especially country dancing. Apparently, that was focused on more than kind of those traditional country dances in the UK, right? I'm now, again, referring to the UK specifically. As you got older, you might do classes in sewing, knitting, woodworking, cooking, and personal hygiene, which I didn't really think about. The younger kids, when they were learning how to write, would often start on trays of sand with a stick for writing, especially in the rural communities. And then they would graduate into chalkboards, and then eventually they would get to paper and pencil, right? And of course, paper and pencil was more expensive, so that makes sense. But I don't know that I'd ever heard the tray of sand piece and a stick before. So some really interesting little components of our ancestors' kind of day-to-day life as they were growing up. So let's see, a couple more comments. Audrey says, I was the first person in my family to stay on at school beyond the minimum leaving age, 14 for my parents and 12 for her grandparents. There were quite a few other people like me at university. It's a boomer thing. Audrey. That's funny. A boomer thing. I'm going to laugh about that all day. Oh, here's another. See, this is a great story as well. Sean saying most of his grandparents were educated in the small tin shack schools first built by their parents in a small town in rural New Zealand. And that's, similar to what I was talking about the homestead states, right? That one-room schoolhouse. I have to imagine it was the same kind of concept in New Zealand, although I didn't know they were made from tin, so that's interesting. But yeah, that same concept of it was a completely different environment than what we experience, and certainly what the next generation is experiencing, right? My daughter's in school now; she's almost 13, and going to school and having your laptop with you, and taking classes online during the pandemic, and all that, it's a completely different world. So it's really interesting to see kind of the progression of our education system over the course of history. So Sue says, my maternal grandmother would have been educated by the workhouse. She lived in the North Dublin workhouse in Ireland from birth to age 14. So yeah, educated in a workhouse. That's another really good resource, right? And all of those workhouse records that we have on Find My Past would be a great way to start that research. You guys have some great stories today. This is good. My maternal grandmother was educated in India, born about 1915. Her father was in the British Army. No idea what her schooling was like and no idea how to find it. Again, that's another good one for just social context. There's got to be a resource out there somewhere that talks about the British citizen life in India during that period. And I honestly, I would start on JSTOR to see if I could find those articles. That's where I would go first to learn about the experience, and then again, narrow it down to a specific experience about your ancestor. This is a great segue. Thank you very much for this. I found my grandmother on a Find My Past school register. Yay, that's excellent. We do have an absolutely incredible collection of school records. And we've been talking about this a lot actually amongst our team, how to get more people to use these records because they're really, really amazing. I went in just this week to find some examples. And what I love about these school records is it's not just their attendance or a registration form, although a lot of them, do include that. But there's also these beautiful records of just the day-to-day world of the school, right? So the log books of the collection are really, really awesome. So make sure that if you find your individual in one of those registration lists, that you also see if there's a corresponding logbook for that school or that area, because they're just full of fascinating stuff, right? So I was reading through one earlier. And this is the Peaslake Church of England School in Surrey. And these notes are from 1914. So I just read through a few days worth of material, right? And this is the administrator of the school documenting what's happening at the school kind of on a day-to-day basis. So on July 3rd, they had gardening lessons that were postponed because the ground was too wet. So they couldn't do their gardening lesson on that day. They also did some geography exams on July 3rd of 1914. On July 17th, the 5-year-olds were examined, and this was a follow-up exam. It was the 5-year-olds that were identified from the previous exam that required special treatment. So they were basically doing a second test, a second exam to see if they'd progressed a little further. July 21st through August 24th was a summer holiday, so they got just over 30 days for their summer holidays. And then on the 24th, when they came back into school, William Laud and George Goddard were promoted from Standard 3 to Standard 4, and Edmund Kemp and Helen Looks were promoted from the Infants Department to Standard 1. I mean, this kind of minutia detail about the people that were in the same school as your ancestors, right? So if you have someone who took a gardening class in school, you know exactly that on July 3rd in 1914, their gardening lesson got delayed because the ground was too wet. Like, there's really no other resource that's going to give you that type of information. So these records, if you haven't used them, if you haven't examined them and really dug in, I really, really would encourage you to do so. If you have an ancestor that's in these records, you're really going to find some incredible information. And Sue, I was so hoping someone would be able to connect with this. She says Peaslake is just down the road for me. It's a small rural school. It's so great. I'm really, really glad that I found an example that someone was able to actually kind of make a direct connection with. That's awesome. Okay, so let me. I'm still reading through comments just to make sure I'm covering things, but there's a lot. You guys are talking about a lot today. It's really, really good. Okay, let's see. I was also going to mention that these school records are a fabulous resource, not just for the students, but the staff as well. Obviously, these logbooks and these administration files do cover the teachers and the other support staff that were working at the schools. So, in one example, the Brighouse National School in Yorkshire in 1910, there was a teacher there named Miss Harrington. Unfortunately, the logbook doesn't give her a first name. Miss Harrington made suggestions on teaching methods for needlework under the new curriculum, and I didn't go back far enough to understand what that new curriculum was. But she was a teacher at the Brighouse National School in Yorkshire, and she was clearly trying to, improve the process and improve the teaching methodology, which is kind of cool. On the flip side of that, back in 1879, the head teacher at the Pellin Lane Halifax School, also in Yorkshire, was criticized for introducing too broad a curriculum. It didn't go into much more detail, but I can imagine that if you deviate too much from kind of reading, writing, and arithmetic, that in 1879, that was enough to be criticized and kind of this, documentation of the school. That's also pretty amazing information to have about your ancestor, if it happens to apply, but just the school in and of itself, right? The school in general. Maybe he was a little bit more forward thinking. then again, maybe he didn't get too, maybe he didn't go too far. Maybe he didn't go far enough in teaching math, right? Maybe he wanted to do the basics and then walk away from it. I don't know. It didn't specify how he was too broad, but just the idea that you have a head teacher at this school that's doing something different and actually finding themselves being criticized in the records as a result. That's a story to dive into, right? I find it all to be just really interesting. I know I've said that over and over again, but it really is fascinating. I come from a background of teachers. I have a number of great aunts, especially on my father's side, who were teachers, especially in Nebraska, Kansas, into Colorado a bit. Washington State, up in the Pacific Northwest. And, these are individuals who got out of their educational system, right, at the age of 14, 15. They finished school, and now all of a sudden they're qualified to be teachers themselves. And my two sisters today are teachers or in the education system here in the States. And so the comparison between them taking their master's classes, right, or working on a PhD versus our family, our ancestors who, kind of just literally the next day were suddenly qualified to be teachers. But, there's a need and, there's a demand there that's different then than it was today and so forth. But I have all these wonderful documents of my great aunt being accepted into different positions across the state of Nebraska before she got married. So there's letters back and forth, and then letters of recommendation from previous employers saying, yeah, she was a really good teacher, you should hire her. So yeah, it's just kind of an interesting component of our family history is this education piece all the way from age 5 up through, their adult careers. I think it's always really interesting. Sean gives a great suggestion. School reports in New Zealand were published in the newspapers in early days. Papers are always a great resource, and indeed they are. If you're looking for New Zealand newspapers and Australian, of course, you want to go to Trove, which is a free newspaper site, which is fabulous. Always a good one to reference. And I would encourage everybody who has heard me say this before, look in every newspaper you can find for the period, because you never know what you're going to be covered in international press, right? I do a lot of research in British newspapers about my American ancestors. And I've done the same thing in New Zealand and Australian newspapers about people in Britain that I'm researching, right? There's a direct connection between those countries, and they would have covered each other's information and their stories. Another good tip or comment here. Paula says the passenger listing for my paternal grandfather lists him as not being able to read or write, and that's true, right? There's ways to kind of at least theorize what kind of education our ancestors had. Passenger lists are one. Census records in the U.S. Covered the ability to read or write. I'm pretty sure Canada did too. Someone may correct me on that. But, definitely there are alternate resources to learning whether or not our ancestors had at least the start of an education, and being able to find a passenger list or a census record that says, yeah, no, they couldn't read. Or another good use is a deed or a probate file or a will that says, he left his mark because he's not able to write his own, to sign the document. So that's a good suggestion. So thanks for that, Paula. It's always good to be able to go to other resources to be able to say, oh, actually, I'm going to make at least a theory that my ancestor could read or could write or could not, and probably had an education of some kind based on that learning. Okay, let's see. I'm reading some more comments. Sarah left a good little story. My maternal nana's older half sister. I might have to draw that out. My older half sister left Manchester at age 13 to be a housekeeper at her uncle's pub in Lincoln. I only found this last week. Oh wow! And stumbling on her gold wedding celebration in the newspaper archives. So yeah, she left school before she. Depending on the year, maybe was legally supposed to at the age of 13, and went to work. That's a great story and a great discovery. Congratulations, Sarah, on finding that this week. Another comment on other resources, right, that we just talked about. Jeannie says it's a clue when you find ancestor signatures on vital records. Right, exactly what I was saying. My great great grandmother signed her name on her marriage record. Then, when she immigrated to America in the mid 1800s, she was the first school teacher in Moroni, Utah. Very interesting. So yeah, if she can sign, right, she's probably had some kind of education. Absolutely. And she didn't say that specifically, but the immigration into Utah, implies a religious affiliation. And that's another clue as well, right? Some religions put more emphasis on education than others. And so if you know that your ancestor was of a particular faith, you might see if there was some kind of private education happening inside the church, and not necessarily just the Church of England, but think about all the other denominations as well, right? There's certainly Catholic schools out there. I know some of my ancestors in Canada were of the Moravian faith. They set up a school specifically for their children in their community. They did not send their students, their children, to the local public school in Canada, the state-funded school. They educated them themselves inside the church. So keep in mind too that religious affiliation might give you some clues as well. Okay, let's see. Oh, that's interesting, Leslie. My grandmother was not allowed to be a teacher because she was left-handed. I've never heard that before. That's very interesting. Okay, good to know. I'm gonna keep that in the back of my mind. You just never know when that's gonna come up. Let's see. Sally, again, my great aunt, who was born in 1888, used to attend a knitting class at her school. They knitted balaclavas for the soldiers in the Boer War. Yeah, see, all these things come when you start to think about kind of this big topic. You start to get into these little details, and it can be really interesting. Okay, here's a good one for Karen that I wouldn't have known about. So thank you for sharing this very much. Appreciate this. There was recently a TV program on BBC Two called Back in Time for School. A group of today's school children went back in time, discovered what it was like to go to school from the late 1800s up through the 1980s. They had to wear clothes of that era, had actual lessons that children would have had back then. That's really interesting. So you should be able to see it on BBC iPlayer. Great for social history. That sounds like a really, really cool program. I wonder if I will ever be able to see it. I don't know, but I'll look it up. Karen, thank you very much for sharing that. That sounds really interesting. All right. Okay, let's see. Andrew says he read the logbook for small school in Pembrokeshire. And there were comments about poor attendance because potatoes needed to be harvested. Autumn was half term in my town, used to be referred to as potato picking. Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. And potatoes, that actually was one of the other comments that I found when I was kind of digging through this, was the way that they actually ate during their school lessons, right? If they were there from 9 to 4, they had to eat lunch at some point. And some of the material I found on historicuk.com gave me this little tidbit about school dinners in the 1920s and 30s specifically. The schools themselves did not have the facilities to offer, prepared dinners, right? Any kind of prepared meal. So in the winter, children would bring a large potato to school. I am reading my notes, with their initials carved into the skin, and they would be baked in the school coal oven while they were kind of still in lessons. And then at dinner time, at lunch, they would get their potato, and that's what they would have to eat. And in the summer, the pupils would bring sandwiches, or if you lived close enough, the children would often go home for lunch. It also went on to say that some school boards offered free school meals to children from poorer families, but these were not available everywhere and certainly not countrywide. So there's an interesting article on historic-uk.com about school specifically in the 1920s and 30s. So if you really want to read more, I would recommend that. It's an interesting one. Audrey, this is going to be good. Audrey always has good comments. I found myself listed in a record at the National Archives. Oh my. I'm not named, but I'm a statistic of one. There's a breakdown of the ages of all the girls in the school in the report by HM Inspectorate. Following the inspection that took place during my first year, I was the only one age 10. Everyone else was age 11 or older. That's pretty cool, actually. You can find yourself like that. Very neat. Very neat. Okay, let's see. We are down to our last 15 minutes, so I'm reading through kind of all the comments to make sure I cover everything that's been discussed here. Let's see. Lynn, your comments interesting. My paternal grandmother and family attended Catholic schools run by religious orders. Sometimes such religious order are a source for records. Absolutely. My mom attended a Catholic school actually in Alabama, all the way through. In fact, I think at one point she went into the public high school and really didn't like it. And she went back to the Catholic school to finish her education. And she was full of stories about how strict they were. But also some really, really fabulous records. They're closed, so unfortunately, I can't see those records for a little while yet. But I am hoping to get to them at some point in my research life. Just still closed to research, just in general, even if you're a descendant, right? Okay. Oh, yeah. And language comes into play, of course. We can't forget about that component. Anya says, I was told my great granny spoke Scottish Gaelic and she had it beaten out of her when she was at school. My sister and I both switched to learner's Gaelic in school as our foreign language. Living in Ireland and learning Gaelic as a foreign language. Okay. Yeah, we'll just leave that right there. But yeah, language is definitely, a different component. And I don't know when foreign languages were actually incorporated into the public school system, if you will. I would have to guess maybe the 80s or 90s. I want to say in place well before the 90s, but maybe the 70s or 80s. I don't know the answer to that, but now I have another thing to Google, right? Let's see. So a comment from our YouTube channel, and I don't have a name, Stamping and Stitching, says, I don't know about my grandparents' education, but my mother had 60 in her class in the 1940s. I assume that's kind of the whole graduating class. I was in a very similar situation, actually. I really had a very small, I grew up in a very small town. So very small community, not as many kids. And yeah, very, very small graduating class. Not quite that small, but small. Thank you for this, Linda. She says she learned French in the 60s in England, so foreign language must go back. I guess then maybe after post World War II, they started incorporating that. I'm still gonna look it up. I want to know. And education's kind of always been part of that oral history culture too, right? I can think of my dad talking about the old high school because he would have attended the old high school and I attended the new high school. We grew up in the same town. He raised us in the same place. And so, yeah, it's, that's always an interesting component too, is this comparing, like, the building itself the old school was torn down, the new school was put up. When did those kinds of things happen in your ancestors' community? And did that change the way that they attended school, or did it happen while they were attending, right? Like, were they one of the students that had to transition into a new space? And think about opportunities for research that go beyond kind of those school records, right? It occurs to me that the Findmypast photo collection would be a great place to probably find schools, photos of schools, and the Francis Firth photo collection as well. To kind of get an idea of what that building was like in that period. I haven't run that search myself, so I don't know exactly, but I do think it would be an interesting experiment to see if you could find your school in that photo collection. So interesting stuff. All right. Still just coming in these last last comments. Oh, this is a good one. Susan says, for Canadians, the back in time for school is available on CBC Gem. So if you happen to be in Canada, that's a good one. I'm still going to look it up, see if I can access it in the US. Interesting. All sorts of, you guys are still just pumping out all of this interesting little stuff. I would like to keep going, but I can't. I get cut off after an hour. Okay, Lynn, her mother just celebrated her 80th high school graduation. See, and that's another, it made me think of something else, right? My grandma used to go at least once a year, they would have kind of a reunion. And I think they called it the 39 Club, if I remember right, or 38 Club, something like that. Whatever year she graduated high school, I don't remember off the top of my head. And it was a group of friends, and they would get together at least once a year for kind of this annual reunion. But it was almost always much more common than that, right? Especially in their later years, when I remember my grandma being very active, right, as I was growing up. I remember actually going a couple of times, and they would go to a restaurant, have lunch, and they would just chat. They were girlfriends, and they would do this, pretty frequently. Again, they had to do it at least once a year. That was kind of their rule, but it was more common to do it monthly or even on some occasions weekly. And I just remember that this group of friends from their school days just supported each other all the way through their life, and they all attended all the major events of life, weddings and funerals, and came to the baby showers and met the grandchildren, right? And it was always a big part of my grandmother's social circle, was the the people that she graduated high school with. So yeah, that's kind of a fun one. Really, it's such a different experience, right? Like I mean, I don't think I'm still connected with anybody I graduated high school with, except maybe my sister. She was a year older than me. Um, not very many, right? But for my grandmother, it was a core group of her social life. So very interesting, very, very different take on the world, right? Okay. A couple other comments, but oh, here's a good one from Roxanne. Just to finish us off, I think, for the day. My daughter is attending the same junior high that my husband went to. My daughter is in the new building, though, same plot of land, but they built the new one next to the old one, and then they took the old one down. So, yeah, a lot of history there, right? And pieces like that, those kinds of stories can be, pretty easily researched through your local historical society, or even the local government may have blueprints, right? Check in the local public library to see if they've got some, small booklet around the school system in the area and the school history of the community. A lot of that kind of stuff gets published on a very regional, local level, and it's essential stuff that we want to make sure that we look at. All right, let's see. Lots of, gosh, you guys are just coming in with so much interesting stuff, but I am running out of time. Let's see. We've got a comment. Oh, Miko, it's about time you joined us. The meeting that I missed to do this must be over, so that's good to know. And my grandmother, Miko says, my grandmother did her schooling in a military training camp, and another grandparent was too poor to go to school. Sometimes we forget how lucky we are to have avoided some of this. Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Um, a good note to end on, I think, is actually this one from Anya. So let's finish with this. I hope future generations look back at my schooling and the lack of support for children with dyslexia being seen as something completely outdated. You know what? I hope so too. Yeah, I think, if nothing else, we've learned over the course of this hour that the school system has changed a lot in pretty much every major country that our community represents. We've gone from, minimum age of the to 14 all the way through, a system that pretty much accepts and almost expects a college degree or university degree. I think education should be at the forefront, obviously, and it was important to our ancestors as well. So we need to make sure that we incorporate that part of their life into their family history and into our research. So yeah, let's absolutely work together to make sure that we discuss and talk about the school system and the environment in which they were raised, and not just their birth, marriage, death, right? But let's get into all of the details of their lives and make sure that we document that. Right. So we're going to close it at that. I'm going to get off my box here. Thank you all very much for participating today. There's been some just incredible stories shared, and a lot of things that I am going to go back and look up again and make sure that I get the full story about. Some interesting things shared today. So thank you very much for doing all of that. Thank you to Jesse for being with us in the comments. And obviously, we'll be back next week with more information, more sessions, more records on Friday. So do watch for that schedule to be posted, and look for those sessions. And if you miss this live, do go back and watch the recordings. They're available on our Find My Past Facebook channel and our YouTube channel. And make sure that you're examining all that and watching all these sessions, because there's some really great learnings, not just from those of us in the Find My Past community, but all of you in the comments as well. So take care of yourselves, take care of each other. I know there's some new restrictions happening across the UK, and some concerns about this new variant, but we will get through this together. And keep researching. Good luck with your research. And we will speak with you next week. Have a fabulous weekend.